recorded. There's still people joining, so I guess we'll wait a couple of minutes. Let me just say by way of background that, of course, the background to today's webinar and the follow-up one on Thursday at the same time is, of course, rising energy bills. But behind the rising energy bills is a much greater concern about climate change. If we use fossil fuel to provide our energy in our home, either heating or electricity, it results in byproducts, greenhouse gases, which congregate in the upper atmosphere and are responsible for global warming. So to be honest, it's something that has to be done. It should have been done, and it should have been done a long time ago already. Time is marching on, so I'm not going to delay any further. I will share the screen with you, or share my screen with you, so that hopefully you can all see this slide. And
yes,
I hope we can now start. So I will do some of the slides. Mehdi will do some of them. John Sharp might join in when it comes to draft busting, and we'll do our best to answer your questions as we go along. So for the first slide, all it shows is where heat is lost. Heat is lost through the walls, through the windows, through the doors, through the roof, and up the chimney. So if we're going to reduce energy bills, then we have to reduce the heat loss through the building. And if we go to the next slide, I think these benefits are all self-evident, but it is just worth going through them briefly, just to make certain that you realize that there are multiple benefits of warmer homes. And if only the politicians realized this, instead of subsidizing energy use, they were to subsidize insulation, we would all be better off. So warmer homes, higher level of thermal comfort, less condensation, so healthier living conditions, less respiratory and pneumonia illnesses, so you don't end up in hospital, better health of the occupants, lower energy bills, and the benefits of warmer homes is that they were, with payback times as short as a few months, you not only have lower bills, but you can also lengthen the life of the building fabric and limit climate change. And if only the politicians realized this, then a lot more money should and could be spent on insulating our home. Remember, the average home lifespan is more than 100 years, so investing in insulation is really a no-brainer. And this is the nub of the problem. This is the problem that we have with housing in the UK. And the problem we have with the housing in the UK is that the heat loss of the building has increased with age. So pre-1964, so halfway along this slide, there was no requirement for any insulation at all. So it was only from 1965 onwards that insulation was required. And then in 1965, only 25 millimeters of insulation in the loft was specified, compared with 300 millimeters today. So if our house is 1968, and when we moved into the house, 25 millimeters of insulation. When our daughter moved into our house in Chessington 3 years ago, not 1 millimeter of insulation, even in the loft. So the real problem is that UK housing stock is under-insulated. And if you live in a town, city like Reading, it has a higher proportion of older housing than the national average, which means there's a higher proportion of housing that have less insulation. So you can see that after 1965, successive increments in the building regs reduced the insulation. So you can see it's less than half today of what it was for pre-1990. So that's the problem that we face, and that's what we've got to overcome. So the first thing to do if you want to reduce your heating bill is to identify the sources of heat loss. And I've listed here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that one should be aware of. And this is something you should do before you contact any installer. You should go through this checklist because there are various options available, some of which you can do yourself. And in a minute, we'll discuss each of these in turn. So are there drafts through the windows or the door frames? And if so, you'll get high ventilation losses. How many of us know how much insulation is in the loft, if any? You can ask your neighbors that. Majority of people will not know, but the minimum required today is 300 millimeters. The next one, bullet 4, do radiators need bleeding? We'll come back to this like the others in a minute, but if your radiators need bleeding, in other words, then they will not have a good heat conduct. It means there's corrosion between the central heating water and the radiators, and reduces the efficiency of the radiators and increases your heating bill by 7 to 10%. Are the external walls cold to touch? If so, no insulation. Windows suffer from condensation, likely to be single glazing. And is your boiler serviced regularly? And if not, it may be operating inefficiently. So it is worth getting your boiler serviced from time to time, both from an efficiency point and also from a safety viewpoint. And we'll now go through each of these in turn to indicate what it is that you could do to reduce the heat loss. There's one other thing you can do. Sorry, in addition to your DIY check, there is something called an energy performance certificate. When you buy or sell or rent a house, you have to have an up-to-date energy performance certificate. Now, the advantage of the energy performance certificate, it lists and describes each of the insulation elements in the home and what can be done to bring them up to present standards, and at what cost. And if you type just on the website energy performance certificate, you may get it for your house. But if you look at the third bullet, inserting your postcode will list your building, and if not your building, other buildings within the same postcode area. So where we live in a close of 10 houses. I can see the insulation state of the houses in the close. We've lived in our house for 45 years, so we don't have an EPC certificate because we've never sold the house. And I've mentioned already, it lists the insulation, measures, ranks, new measures, and costs. So you've got two choices there: do it yourself and consulting the energy performance certificate. Are there any questions at this stage, or are you happy with what we've got?
Hey, Rainer.
Yep.
There was one question about having loft insulation squished down under floorboards. Is it less efficient like that than having it in the open, or do the floorboards actually help?
Well, what we did in our daughter's house, we actually put some additional beams down so the insulation wasn't squashed. If you squash it, it's not so effective because air, as long as it can't move, is a good insulator. So ideally, you shouldn't squash it. But if you have to squash it because you need to do that, it won't be quite as effective. So you should put a bit more insulation in. So maybe instead of 300, you should put 400 millimeters and then squash it.
Yeah. Got a couple of things we're looking at. So,
John, if I can add something here, there are some products in the market that we can purchase from any DIY.
You need better Wi-Fi.
I just boiled the kettle.
Apparently, there is a microphone open.
I'm sorry, there's two conversations going on.
Yeah.
You need to mute your microphones because we can only have one person talking at once, please. Do go ahead, Mehdi.
Okay. I was about to say that there are products like extended legs for the boarding in the loft that everyone can find from the DIY shops that can increase and provide a gap in the loft to add more insulation without compressing the existing insulation or compressing the additional insulation for boarding the loft. And as Rainer mentioned, when we are pressing the insulation in the loft, we significantly reduce the level of insulation that the material can provide us, because we are removing the air, which is the best insulation from the material. And on top of that, it increases significantly the risk of condensation in the cavity between the ceiling and the boarded area in the loft.
So the optimum solution is in our loft is we've boarded up only enough of our loft to store things in. Majority of the loft, the insulation is just sitting there simply because you couldn't even get in there because we've got a pitched roof. So for the majority of it, but if you need to do storage, please board it up. And then whatever you store on top will also have some insulation value as well. And once it goes into the loft, it's unlikely to come out again.
And one last point, if I can add here, if you're boarding, you have to make sure that from the top of the insulation layer and the bottom of the boarding, there should be at least something about 5 to 10 centimeters for ventilation in that cavity to avoid the condensation.
Yeah, we'll come back to that, but let's move on. John Sharp, sorry, because there's another John Booth. John, do you want to talk about draft excluder, please?
Yep, sure. Drafts probably are the cheapest and easiest way to improve the comfort of your home and also reduce your energy usage. So you can, first of all, you need to detect where your drafts are around the room. It might be very obvious. There are things like letterboxes. They can be a fantastic source of drafts. I see many letterboxes without anything on them, just holes in the front doors, which must be horrendous. I tried various draft excluding approaches, but ended up just putting an outside box on the in the porch for the letters, which meant that I could completely seal the letterbox, which was very effective. Doors can be a major issue for drafts. There can be gaps if you've got an older house, etc. Then there can be big gaps around doors. So you can see on the right hand side some rather nice draft excluder. It's on a blue door on a blue wall, which makes it look a bit strange. But it's effectively a aluminium extruded piece which you can just nail on where you need it, and then there's a some sort of a foamy plastic extruded strip which has got a curve on it which seals up very effectively. So I've got that around my front door. The windows can be an issue, especially if you have old sliding sash windows. The easiest way to do that, to completely block them up during the winter, is just to put sellotape over all the gaps. You can get proprietary draft excluders to go on the sash strips and such like, and you can, if there are massive gaps, you can put draft excluder like that at the bottom of the and tops of the sash windows. But the problem with that is that you might then find that you can't actually shut them properly or lock them, so that might not be feasible. Other places where you can get drafts is if you've got a suspended floor. If it's an old Victorian house, as many are in Reading, then that can be directly over bare earth. So if you can seal that up somehow, in my case, for the ground floor, I put in hardboard and then lay thick underlay and fitted carpets on top. Anything which will completely seal it, whether is going to make a big difference. And also around the edges of the skirting boards and such like, if you've got drafts coming up around there, if you can put some sealant in it, that will help. But it will, and the other one, of course, is chimneys. You can get a thing called a chimney sheep, which is especially designed. You have to measure your chimney, and you can get a piece of like a wool ball which you shove up your chimney. It's the advantage of that is it still breathes, so you don't get problems with damp, but it can make a big difference to the heat that's disappearing up chimneys if you have chimneys. You can also get plastic balloons, which are much cheaper, but possibly don't seal as well. But there you are. There's a few things, but that's probably looking at these sorts of things takes you a little while to work out where they're coming from. If you use something like a joss stick or something, so you can got a little bit of smoke that's going, that will help you to identify where the drafts are if it's not immediately obvious to you. But the cheapest and most effective way of reducing your heat loss is by looking at your drafts, I think.
Thanks, John. We'll then move on to the next one. Now, this is something most people don't know about, but it's also one that affects your heat output. And the first sentence is critical. If your radiators need bleeding or your boiler cuts out between servicing, then corrosion is occurring between the central heating water and the radiators. This has several effects, downside effects on the efficiency of the radiators. It reduces the area of the thermal transfer and reduces the efficiency. So to limit corrosion, you need to add a small dose of inhibitor descaler chemicals whenever your boiler is serviced. And we're talking about something like 250 cc, or the equivalent of a cup of water to the central heating water. And by reducing corrosion and taking these products back into solutions, possible to increase the radiator efficiency by 7%. And the cost is negligible. If on a one-off basis, the cost is, if you bought it over the counter, is £15. But if your heating engineer buys it in 5-litre packs, the cost of this chemical is about £5. And for £5 investment, you could save yourself £50 to £100 a year in your heating bills. But there are two other benefits that you need to be aware of if you can limit corrosion. The radiators will operate hotter due to higher thermal output with more uniform temperature distribution. So you can operate the boiler for longer times at lower temperatures, so reducing the standing losses. And both of these will add to the overall efficiency of your heating system and will reduce your heating bills. And there is an offer here, a free offer by one of the suppliers called Vexo, and they're willing to supply as free issue 3 years supply of this inhibitor descaler. And if you want to take up their offer, then you need to do that email address, voucher@vexoint.com. I will add that these slides will also be uploaded as well as the recording to the Reading Climate Action Network website. So you will be able to do that. But it's worth bearing in mind this is a free offer and is worth, is worth a lot. Could save yourself several £100 in heating bills. So why not take up their offer? But the offer is limited to the first 50 people who take up the offer. Yes.
Just come in here. Yeah. One thing that I found with plumbers is that when they come to do a service of your boiler, they won't check your the level of inhibitor in your system unless you ask them to do it. So they will do it, but you have to ask them. If you just let them do a service, don't assume that they will do it, because in my experience they don't.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I had a British gas engineer come in, well, must be about 5 years ago, charged me 90 quid, and all he did was to check whether there was any carbon monoxide coming out of the boiler, didn't check the inhibitor level, didn't do any other checks, didn't clean the boiler or anything else like that. Yeah, John, you're absolutely right. You must ask the heating engineer or plumber to install the inhibitor. And that's one reason for this voucher scheme, because the thing is, Vexo will only send the inhibitor to you if your heating engineer agrees to add it. It'll take them no more than a minute to add this inhibitor, but you'll get the benefit for the next year and save yourself maybe up to £100 in heating bills. So it's a question of educating the plumber, because clearly if you don't ask, you won't get. It's a very important point. Thank you, John, for mentioning that. Mehdi, this is now your slides.
Thanks, Rainer. I think we were talking about the loft insulation. One point that I just wanted to highlight here: insulation in loft is the easiest type of insulation that we add to our home to significantly reduce the level of heat losses from our homes. Insulation of the wall cavity or solid wall are more complex than adding insulation to the loft. We can simply get some insulation from DIY shops and put the insulation in the loft. A couple of things that we have to remember: health and safety. If you are doing it as a DIY job, please make sure that you are putting your feet on the joist, not on the plasterboard in the loft. Otherwise, it would be, your leg may go to the floor below through the plasterboards. And generally speaking, if you have a look at the loft and if you see something less than 300 millimeters insulation in the loft, it means that you need additional top-up for top-up of loft insulation in the loft. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you are thinking about boarding the loft, make sure that there is a 5 to 10 millimeter gap between top of the insulation and bottom of the board for ventilation to avoid any condensation in the cavity between the board and the ceiling of the floor below. That was the main point that I just wanted to highlight regarding the loft insulation.
Eddie, can we just check whether there are any queries about loft, any more queries about loft before we go to the next
Yes,
slide?
please.
John, any queries at all?
None have come in.
None have come in, right? Well, then let's go to the next slide then. Okay, Betty.
Insulation of the external walls are not as simple as insulation in the loft. Pre-1945, we have almost no cavity in the building stock, and the external wall are solid walls without cavity. But post-1945, buildings has a cavity, and there are possibility that you can inject insulation foams inside the cavity to provide the very good level of insulation. There are companies that are working on injection of the insulation foams in the cavity walls, and also, to the best of my memory, I'm sure Rainer would be able to advise better in terms of the grants. There are grants available for the insulation of the external walls. But pre-1945 buildings, old building with solid wall, insulation of the external wall is not easy. There are two main approaches for insulation of the solid walls: putting the insulation outside or putting the insulation inside. There are different schools of thought which one is more appropriate, but generally speaking, I myself belong to those categories that it would be waste of resources if we exclude the heat, the thermal mass of the building by putting the insulation inside. On top of that, putting the insulation inside reduce the size of the room inside the building, net lettable area of the building. But we have to appreciate that the insulation of the external walls, solid walls from outside, are so complex. We need to think about the vapor barrier, we need to think about the condensation, and it's not cost effective to insulate the solid wall from external external side of the wall. Is there any question about the insulation of the external wall, John?
No, but a question has come in about loft insulation.
Yes.
DIY install. What brands are best, and where would you recommend buying it?
I can only tell you what I did with my daughter's house in Chessington, which had no insulation at all. We went to be in the local B&Q, where you can buy these rolls of insulation, and they are all mineral wool. So they really do look like a woolen blanket, is the best way of expressing it. The mineral wool is, I believe, is the cheapest form of doing it, because it's essentially an element that appears, or a compound that appears in the Earth's crust. And the wool is produced by heating these slabs of rock up, and they expand into these fibers. So it's a very energy efficient process, and I can thoroughly recommend it. So mineral wool, B&Q, but almost any other of the DIY outfits will stock it as well. It's widely available, and it's not expensive, and it comes in rolls that normally will fit between your joists. So what you need to do is to measure up the gap between your joists. Those are the wooden beams that hold the ceiling up, or the ceiling's attached to it. And then when you go to your DIY shop, you need to make certain that the rolls will fit between the joists. So you don't actually have to do any cutting other than at the end where it goes under the roof.
And if I can add something again here, if you are thinking about doing it as a DIY job, please make sure that you are following the instruction from the manufacturer in terms of health and safety and how to install it. And also, again, if you are going to the loft, making sure that you are putting your feet on the joist, not on the plaster. That's the very important point, that sometimes those who are very beginner in DIY and want to do the loft installation make a big mistakes, very costly mistakes for themselves.
Right. Then
what I would say about that is it's pretty nasty stuff to handle in a confined space. The dust and that is pretty awful. So it's good to wear something like disposable overalls or washable overalls, gloves, a mask, so that you're not breathing these fibers directly down into your mouth. I think these are worth doing when you're handling that stuff in confined space. And the other thing about that is you should maybe try some of the builders merchants, as well as the DIY shops. I mean, I've bought quite a lot from Selco and various other builders merchants. Sometimes you find that they're cheaper and they do sell direct to the public. You need to maybe fill something in the case of Selco, but they can be a lot cheaper than your average B&Q. I think
let's move on then to
a couple more questions.
Oh yes, please.
Also, what government schemes are available, if any, for loft insulation?
I will answer that in a subsequent slide because I've got the reference as well. Right. Yep.
And John, you put in a question. Do you want to ask that question directly, John Booth?
I can when I find out how to unmute myself. Yeah, insulating external walls sounds as though it's a very good thing to do if it can be done. But are there examples of good practice which could be shared? It needs to look good and be cost effective and not lead to condensation. Do local builders know how to do it yet?
Well, the answer to that question about insulating walls externally, solid walls, is in the Reading area, no more than 2 kilometers from where I live in Yateley, is a firm called the Insta Group, who specialize in insulation, external insulation of buildings, and have insulated a fair number of buildings already in Reading. Now, they not only install insulation themselves, but they sell the insulation to other installers. But they insist that the other installers go on a training course so they know how to correctly use the external insulation and to put up the vapor barrier, which John has mentioned, between the insulation and the walls to prevent condensation coming through the wall. So there is a local group who specialize in this area, and they are part of our warmer home groups in Reading. I think we ought to move on to insulating windows, Mehdi.
Yeah, of course, thank you. Windows, the body of the literature shows that in several cases that the windows are the main source of heat loss in buildings. They account for, depends on the study that you look at, something between 30 to 50% of the heat loss from the buildings are coming from windows. And the most common reason for this huge heat losses are when we have a old single glazed window, and those windows are not designed with the latest for example, according to the latest building regulation in terms of their U value, and the heat loss through those single glazing windows are significant. To avoid the heat loss through the windows, there are some firms that are offering secondary glazing, but they are really less effective than actual double glazed windows. But there are options if someone wants to go for the putting additional layer on the existing single glaze window. The problem is the glass itself is one issue, and heat losses through the frame is another issue. When we have a single glaze window, the frame of the window is doesn't have a high thermal insulation, and that cannot be sorted by adding another layer of the glass on top of the existing one. Of course, the double glazing is the best solution to reduce the heat losses from the windows, but there is a reasonably high level of cost associated with replacement of the single glazed window with the double glazed window. To be honest, I'm not aware of the schemes for replacement of the existing windows, but I'm sure Rainer would let us know if he knows about the schemes that can support for the replacement of the single glaze windows to double glaze one. I think it's about the windows, and in the next, I was talking about the cost associated with replacement of the single glaze window and to double glaze window, as well as we were talking about the cost effectiveness of the loft insulation and how expensive it is to add insulation to this external side of the, for example, a solid wall. In the next slide, Rainer will provide us with some flavor of the payback period associated with this replacement and refurbishment of the buildings by increasing the insulation level, replacing the window, and so on.
Can we just check, John, any questions about windows?
No.
Okay, well then, now we come to payback time. So payback time is the cost divided by the average annual bill. So therefore, it's essentially how long do I have to wait until I start doing savings. Now, a lot of this depends on clearly whether you do it one-off or whether you do it as a group, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But as an order of magnitude, you can see that there are at least 3 measures where the payback time is 1 year or less. And again, it depends in the case of the loft, this assumes there's no insulation in the loft. It assumes that there's no inhibitor or descaler in your central heating system, and all your windows need draft busting. If some of them have already got it, then clearly the payback time will come down. Clearly, if you have an installer with the loft insulation, it will be more expensive because you've got to pay for the labor. But on the other hand, the installer won't take very long, provided you've cleared the loft before he comes along, because he has to spend time taking things out of the loft that will do it. So it's a bit longer. And cavity wall insulation is a bit more expensive, up to 2 years payback time. And certainly for loft insulation and cavity wall insulation, there is grant funding available, and I will come back to that in a minute. In terms of inhibitor descaler, if you take up the VEXO offer, the cost will halve. or less. And again, with draft busting, there are grant schemes available which would reduce your draft busting costs. The two high cost ones are double glazing and external wall insulation. So the answer to double glazing, if you don't have much money, is to install it in the rooms that you use the most. So if you use the sitting room the most, then that should be double glazed first. Forget about the rest of the house. If you use the kitchen a lot, double glaze the kitchen. And the same applies with external wall insulation. You don't have to externally insulate all the walls. You could externally insulate, for example, one of the walls, again in the room that is most used, possibly the living room, but could be any other room like that. But both of these will reduce your heating bill substantially, but there are much longer payback time. So here we are. This is the answer to one of your questions that was posed. What grants are available and what funds are available? So if you're on low income or on benefits, there are grants called either eco or sustainable warmth that will cover loft insulation and cavity wall insulation. They will not pay for external wall insulation and will not pay for double glazing. But there are funds available, and those are the contact points for doing it. Remember, you can download this slide set from the Arcan website. And that assumes that you own your home. If you're living in a social housing, or living in social housing or rent social housing, and your heating bill is high or the dwelling's not warm, you need to request your housing provider to apply for this, what's called the Social Housing Decarbonization Grant. Only he or she can apply for it, not yourself. And there is a minimum level now for all rented accommodation, which is EPC level E. So if you're living in a house that is rented house that's very cold, you could ask the question, or you can go to the EPC site and check that your housing provider has upgraded the insulation to the minimum level. And this will increase again to EPC level C by 2028. The boiler upgrade grants we'll discuss on the next webinar on Thursday. But there is another option available, and this is the so-called green mortgage. Now, it's not commonly known, but there are a fair number of mortgage providers who will provide a green mortgage for warmer homes with a lower interest rate. If you go on the website, you can find anything from 10 to 20 people offering a green mortgage. And the advantage is that if you have a lower interest rate, the idea is that you would invest the money that you've saved in paying for the insulation. And why should the mortgage provider provide a lower interest rate? And the answer is it's a better investment for them because the fabric will last longer and the house will need less maintenance. So therefore, if you live in your own house and you plan to upgrade the insulation, contact your mortgage provider and see whether they'll provide a green mortgage. And if they don't, the advice would be to find a mortgage provider who does. And then the other option you've got, I've already mentioned that, Vexo's free inhibitor offer, cost you nothing. And there's a voucher there that you need to do. Are there any queries about this, John?
No.
No, we'll move on because you can always come back and do that. And this really is the last slide, unless there are further points you want to do. And what to do next? Well, if you've followed so far, then the thing to do is clearly you need to identify the sources of the heat loss. And we've suggested either the DIY warmth check, which you can do yourself, and you can download a form from the Arcan website, or consult the EPC certificate, Energy Performance Certificate Register. If you're going to reduce the heat loss, undertake the low-cost measures first. Third bullet, check eligibility for grants, identify support. You should contact Citizens Advice Reading, and the email address is given there. There's an energy team in Reading who can advise you on that. But there's a new initiative that we have just started called Insulate Together. And this is a group buying initiative. So instead of individuals contacting installers and getting them to give one-off quotes, the idea is to collect the names. Citizen Advice Reading will collect the names and then go out to try and do a group purchase. So clearly, if you're going to insulate 20 lofts, say, rather than one loft, the price will come down because you buy all your insulation at once. You have a lorry that goes around delivering these things. So there is an option here. And this is a new initiative. We've only just identified this as a means of reducing the cost of insulation. So once you've done your DIY warmth check, then the thing to do is to contact Citizens Advice in Reading and join the list of people so we can undertake a group buying initiative. And then there are a set of information leaflets, which you can download from the Reading Climate Action Network website, stroke Creating Warmer Homes. There's something like 10 leaflets which deal in more detail. They're only A5 leaflets, but deal in more detail with any of the things we've now discussed. So that takes us to the end of the presentation. We're now open for a question and answer session. And then I should remind everybody that on Thursday, we will give another webinar, which is if you are in a position where you would like to convert your heating system, how you can set about doing this to low carbon. So any further questions, chats, comments, anything to do with realizing that what we need to do is to reduce our heat loss, reduce our heating bills, create warmer homes, and more important, limit climate change. We may not suffer here in the UK, but just look at what's happening in Pakistan with flooding there, tornadoes in the Philippines, tornadoes in Japan, tropical storms in Central America. The climate is changing and many people are being affected. So any further questions, comments? Now's your time to ask your question. Any further questions, John?
No more comment.
Rainer, while the participant may think about their question, I just wanted to add, if I may,
yes,
one point here. We were talking about the energy performance certificate that you may be able to have access to from the website that Rainer introduced, or should have been in the pack when if you recently, over the past, let's say 15 years, you bought your house or you rented a property. But we have to take one thing from the EPCs with the pinch of salt. EPCs This is the fact about the EPCs. EPCs, energy performance certificates, are based on the estimation of the energy consumption associated with building, not the actual energy consumption associated with building. And you may see that your actual energy consumption is higher or lower than whatever estimated in the EPC. It's not something unusual. The most important thing in EPC is that EPC is an indicator of the energy performance. On top of that, at the end of the EPC, you would be provided with you should have been provided with the list of recommendation to how to enhance the rating of the building in terms of the thermal performance. And those recommendations are very helpful and good indicators for the steps that you can take to increase the energy efficiency of your buildings with estimated amount of cost associated with those improvements. You know, that last part of the EPC's recommendation, I do strongly recommend to have a look and see what is recommended by your EPC assessors in terms of how you can improve the thermal efficiency and energy performance of your building.
I could add, before we go, I noticed there's another question. I could add, there are some installers who will actually undertake a survey of your house free of charge, assuming that in the end you will buy or install some of the insulation. Certainly the Insta group, which is a local group here, will do this for you. And what they actually do is they go around with infrared meters, so they're actually able to check physically where the heat loss is, so they can give you an accurate idea of what's required to reduce the heat loss. So do bear in mind that there are some installers who are able to survey your house at no cost. But be careful, there are other installers who are not competent installers who, once they get into your house, I'm not certain what they will do, but I don't know that they're competent. So you need to be careful about which installers to use. A list of competent installers is one of the things that we're thinking of drawing up, at least for Reading, so that people will know that these are ones that have installed insulation in Reading and are trustworthy and reliable. John, there's some more questions I noticed.
Yeah, okay, so the next one is foam a better solution than wool insulation? I think there's quite a lot that can be said about this. Does someone else want to start?
It's a very difficult question to ask. We can answer in different ways. It depends on what we interpret as better, whether we are talking about the environmental impact about the associated with production of those insulation, or whether we are talking about the thermal insulation effect of these materials. It depends on the type. We have different types of foam, and it's very general to say whether foam, for example, if we stick to the thermal insulation, there are different foams with different chemical involved that have different thermal conductivity. It's very difficult to say whether foam is better than wool insulation, and wool insulation depends on the density of the wool and the thickness of the wool. It's very difficult to answer that question. My recommendation is to check the thermal conductivity of the material first before making decision about whether to go with foam or whether to go with other type of insulation, mineral wool or so on.
There is one other point that is worth mentioning in this question of wool versus foam, and that is that the wool is actually fibers that are blown into the cavity. So it's a very quick process, because what they do is they drill holes in your outer coarse brickwork at 1 meter center, and they actually then blow the fibers into the cavity. So within a few hours, they will have insulated the entire cavity. The foam is a much more difficult thing to do because the foam, when it sets, expands and contracts, and therefore there are difficulties. So my advice and experience would be to use mineral rather than foam. But again, the best advice is to ask your installer to give you references for people who've had their walls insulated and get their experience what's involved. But fibers are the quickest and the cheapest option.
Yeah, you're assuming there that we're talking about mineral wool and not sheep's wool, because you can also use.
Oh, we're always talking about mineral wool. It's the same thing that you have the mineral wool for the fiber blankets you lay the loft with. That's the most efficient option.
Just one of the main differences, if you're using it for internal insulation, is that with the foam, it's not permeable to air, in which case you have to be a lot more careful with your vapor barriers and such like. With mineral wool, if you're using it on insulation, which I did about 30 years ago on the parts of my house, you don't have that problem because it breathes. So you don't get a problem with damp because of the air moves through it. Other parts of the house that I've done more recently using these high efficiency foams, I had to do it a lot more carefully. So I had to put in a Parge coat on the outside, to sort of prime the brickwork to make sure there's no air gaps on the brickwork. Put in the foam, and then on the outside of that, put on a board with a sealed aluminium back board on the outside, and then make sure that all of the gaps were again sealed with tape. I have to say it's amazingly more efficient. I could feel it as I was putting it in the room. The room was getting warm, so I didn't need to heat the room, although it was in the middle of winter. It's just my body heat working in the room was heating the room up. But it is a lot more, you have to be a lot more careful, and there's a lot more thinking about what you do.
Next question then, John.
Next one is where will the presentations? Oh no, it's from John Booth. How much does an EPC cost?
I don't know because I haven't had one done in my house in 45 years, but I think it costs somewhere between 50 and £100. But because it's a trained assessor who comes in, and he will take an hour or at least an hour to go through everything, hopefully with infrared temperature probe to do that.
If I can add something here, it's the last time that I had some information about the cost of EPCs. There were something around £300 to £500 for EPCs, and that's the latest update that I have. About 2 years ago. Yeah.
Well, all I can say is the DIY warmth check will cost you nothing. And the only thing you have to do is, well, one of the things we will do most probably in Reading and also in Yateley where I live is that we will buy, or the Energy Citizen Advice will buy some infrared temperature probe, so you can go around the house and do your DIY warmth check. To do that, they will just lend this temperature measurement to you, so you can actually measure where it is. Next question, John.
Where will the presentation and recording of this event be uploaded?
It's on there. That's the last bullet on this slide, www.readingcan.org.uk, creating warmer homes. So that's both the slide presentation and the recording.
Yeah, and there was a general one about the other Reading Climate Festival webinars will be, I'm guessing they'll be up on the readingcan.org.
Yes, all the webinars will also be uploaded, both the slide sets and the recordings. Yeah.
And then we've got a question from John Booth about concerns about moisture and condensation problems with cavity walls. Does someone want to say something about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to say something about it. It's already been mentioned by Mehdi, and this problem of foam versus fiber. With the fiber, there always is an air gap. So any moisture that, brickwork is porous. So if you have driving rain, so that's rain driven by the wind, it will penetrate the pores of the brickwork and trickle into the cavity between there. Now, if the cavity is filled with foam and there are gaps between the foam because it's expanded, then you can get moisture coming through to the inner skin. So the advice for people living in areas where there's driving rain, and I'm particularly thinking of Scotland, we've got at least one person from Scotland, James Doig from Dundee, who's joined us. The thing to do is to use mineral wool and not foam. There is one other solution you can do, which I've done myself, and that is you can buy a waterproofing solution, a silicone solution. It's not very expensive, something like £15 for a 1 litre do, and you can paint the outside of your brickwork with this solution. I do this about every 5 years, and that seals the pores of the brickwork. But the cheapest solution is mineral fiber rather than foam. The problem is with foam is that you can't actually tell whether or how the condition is inside the cavity. So if, for example, you've got cracks between the foam, there's no way you can fill them, and therefore you have a problem. With the mineral wool, all that will happen over a period of time is it will settle, and somebody like the Insta group is quite happy to top up your mineral wool then. Any other questions?
No, just people thanking us and signing out.
Yeah, well, if I wrap this up, I would like to thank you all for taking part. I hope you will consider upgrading the insulation in your home. Join our Insulate Together initiative, which hopefully will result in lower costs. And if you would like to join us on Thursday, when we'll discuss more about heating systems as opposed to insulation losses, please do. At the same time, there is a different address for that, so you'd have to go back to Energy Bright and log in to do that. So thank you all for taking part. Very much appreciated. And I hope you will end up with warmer homes this winter.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was quite successful, I thought, wasn't it?
Yeah, well done, Rainer. You did great job.
No, but wait a sec. Let's just stop the recording. Hang on.